Hey guys, Dory. So this video is going to be about Chapter 4. So we're in Program 3, Fat is a Family Affair. And this is the book that we're reviewing, that we're going over every week. And wow, I hope you guys got to read your chapter this week. This is some really, really, really deep stuff. We're halfway through the book, and definitely chapters 2 and 3, very eye-opening, very, very eye-opening. In fact, 2 and 3 might, we've talked about this in the past, might have made you a little angry, depending on, what you've been able to kind of draw from it. And how honest you've been able to get with yourself. Even as I'm reading it, I see so many areas of my life that it can transfer to when it talks about just human behavior and the struggles that so many of us have. So I want to talk about this chapter in particular, and I've got a whole series of notes here that I want to go over because there's so much to these chapters and they're so long that I found myself in tears a couple times through chapter 4. But let's start in the beginning and talk about really what the chapter is about. And the name of chapter 4 is Why Are We Together? And Judi is talking about the relationship between a confluent personality, which we've learned is also another term for a codependent, and also the food obsessed, which in this program, it's kind of almost another name also for a food addict. Sometimes I do interchange those terminologies, food obsessed or food addict. I think Judi is careful with her terminology. I think the reason that she pulled those terminology out, addict, she really basically took the word addict and turned it into obsessed. Which totally fits. That's accurate. And she took the confluent or the codependent personality verbiage, and she turned it into the confluent personality, meaning that that's the person that is basically in the relationship with the food obsessed. But understand, the food obsessed person can also be that CP. They can be that codependent personality and vice versa. So a lot of times there's that perpetuating cycles of all of it. So it's very interesting to study human behavior and addiction, and I've learned a lot of this even going through ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and when they talk about the triangle of different needs, number one, and different fractures in adult children of alcoholics, they make for perfect addicts, and also perfect codependents or confluent personalities, just because of their even in an ACA, their three primary addictions are fear, excitement, and pain. They're addicted to their own pain. They're addicted to fear, and they fear a lot. And so there's a lot of that, talking about that in this book. I'm always interested in it because I love human behavior. I love studying why people do what they do, because I'm studying myself. Why do I do what I do? Why do I have the relationships that I do? And so let's talk about chapter 4. I thought it was really interesting that she opened up this chapter saying that one food obsessed person keeps 15 to 20 confluents, which are codependents. I'm going to keep using that term throughout my videos because I think we can relate it better because we've heard that term more. So one food obsessed person can keep 15 to 20 confluents, which is codependents, busy. Why? Because they're constantly trying to fix that person, right? And because of that person's addictive nature and addictive behavior, they're cycling, right? They're cycling between falling apart and getting comfort from food, and the confluent personality is over here constantly trying to put things back together. That's what they know to do because they're used to always fixing. And again, I'm going to relate a lot of what I know from ACA, and you're going to hear me use those terms a lot because that's one of the 2 or 3 programs that I work, between OA, ACA, and Al-Anon. I've learned so much going through ACA about human behavior and coming from dysfunctional families and family dynamics, and it is no wonder that we do what we do. What I believe, though, is that we can change. I do believe we can change. Is it difficult? It takes a lot of effort. So I don't think it helps us at all to think, yeah, it's going to be really hard. It's new. Behaving in any new way is new. It's really not hard to be a functional versus dysfunctional person. It's just we're used to being dysfunctional. And this chapter talks a lot about that, about how even getting into emotional sobriety means that we get bored, because we're used to having chaos and everything around us. And I have to be totally honest with myself as I go through ACA. And it's hard. It's hard facing those truths. That's what's difficult for me, is facing truth and reality. And I believe that's the hard part for anyone. Making behavior changes, I'm not sure that's the harder part. I think the hardest part is actually facing truth about ourselves and also doing it with compassion. So it talks about when the FO is falling apart, the food obsessed, the CP tries to put things back together. So she talks about also how food makes the food itself makes the food obsessed feel super achieving and functional. Why? Because it's an outlet. It's just one more outlet to funnel stuff emotions down with, and to funnel behavior into, so that they don't have to think about anything else. Food is comfort. This is all about comfort. It's, in fact, the last line in this chapter, I busted out crying when she talked about Karen Carpenter and how anorexics and bulimics, which understand her definition of a bulimic also is that that's just somebody who binges. It's not that binge and purge. It's just somebody who binges. That term has been kind of manipulated. But when the food obsessed is over here feeling super achieving and functional because they've been comforted by food, right? They have filled that hole temporarily. But we know what happens when you're filling that hole with unhealthy things, which when we're guzzling down food in excess, it becomes unhealthy. We're not eating to live, we're living to eat. And so that temporarily is filling that void and that pain. However, in addition to, it's making the confluent benefit from the food obsessed energy. So when they're in that cycle, they're always in different cycles, right? So when the food obsessed is guzzling down food and they're feeling all empowered and on a high, okay, because anytime you're indulging in an addiction or an obsession, there's a high. And this is where ACAs also have to get really honest with themselves, because we ride highs and lows. Again, we're addicted to fear, excitement, and pain. It's often what makes an addict, period. And so while the food obsessed is over here, suddenly feeling better just because they binged, or have, comforted themselves with corn dogs and funnel cakes, they also might start to feel sick as well, but they also might feel, satiated, full, because they had that release. But what happens is always after that addiction's indulged is the self-loathing comes in. And this is the dichotomy always between addiction. It's that indulging in what comforts us instantly but is self-destructive in the long run, versus once that's done, then we fall into the self-loathing and the shame and the blame and all of these perpetuating cycles. So the codependent, the confluent over here, is continually benefiting from it because that's what they know. They're used to funneling all of their energy into someone else and trying to control that which is uncontrollable, which is the person who has the greater obsession with something, right? I mean, this can relate to alcohol, drugs. I mean, it can relate to anything. So, but it's interesting to study the dynamics between a codependent and any type of addict. A food addict is no different, a food obsessed. So I'm going to keep interchanging those terms just because I find it easier. So one of the things that she talks about also in this chapter is that addictions and obsessions never get better on their own. I love that she confronts this because this is one of the main things that you're going to learn in recovery. If you ever choose to get into full recovery, and that takes meetings, that takes work, that takes joining a 12-step group, it takes coaching, it takes sponsorship, it takes programs like this, because this program is even propelling you to a place of healing. And programs like this are so important because you can even learn all the emotional side. And if you can't marry that with the practicalities of food prepping and keeping things simple, learning about even the 4 pillars of health, which you've learned if you've gotten to this program, or if you haven't and you've skipped the 4 pillars of health, you need to go back to that so that you learn that solid foundation for what it is to stay healthy. This is a delicate balance, and it's also a balance where we have to become obsessed with what's good instead of obsessed with what's bad. Right now, we're obsessed with the things that are self-destructive. That's what makes an obsessive or addictive person that is self-destructing in some area of life, whether it's relationships or food or alcohol or drugs or sex or pornography or gambling. The list goes on. You're funneling that need to be fulfilled inside, which you're missing, that longing, that loneliness. And she talks about that in this chapter too. And what I love, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and I'm kind of going to go back and forth. What I love that she talks about is that loneliness that we feel inside, because I feel that. And I have my own obsessions, right, that I work on. That's why I go to 12-step programs. And so you're not less than for admitting that. You're better than, because once you can admit a problem, you can start to do something about it and you can start to heal it. There's nothing shameful about admitting that you have a problem. What's desperately sad is to live in that shame, not living in recovery. And I'll tell you, from a non-recovered to a semi-recovered, I guess I'll call it, state, I don't feel fully recovered, even close to, because really working the program with sponsorship through ACA, that's when I'll feel more prepared to even remotely say that. But I know it's lifetime. But when talking about addiction gets worse, so this is so important, because any obsession or addiction, anywhere where we're creating an area of life that is, it's manifesting things that we don't ultimately want. That, we don't want to live with excess weight. We don't want to, no one ever grew up saying, hey, I want to be an addict, or I want to be overweight, or I want to be unhealthy, or I want to be miserable. Nobody grew up saying that, but it's because of a lot of things that have happened along the way that has created that kind of behavior. And it is behavior. It's behavior. It's behavior, and it's fueled by emotions. And so we have to learn to start to change our states of thinking. I did that just a little bit even over the past few days. I had to start telling myself, you can't indulge the suffering. You have to shift away from that. I have to constantly get help and change my mindset, so that I shift myself away from indulging in my own suffering with my own pain, problems, perceptions. And just life, things that go on, things that oftentimes I can't control, and there's things that you can't control. But going back to the addictions and obsessions, they never get better on their own. I want you to hear that. I'm going to say it again. They never get better on their own. They always get progressively worse. Addiction and obsession, when you indulge it, and you do, because it's an addiction and an obsession, it always gets worse. If you don't have interception in there with a recovery program or coaching or mentorship or getting really honest with self, that's not going to get better. It's just going to continue to get worse. And that's what addictions and obsessions do. So, one of the things that she talks about is knowing your addiction gets you nowhere. Finally knowing that your addiction is getting you nowhere. You know, a lot of times, unfortunately, people have to hit rock bottom and feel that severe pain so that they say, okay, enough is enough and I'm ready to do something about it. That is the beginning of recovery. It's the beginning. And a lot of times people hit that over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, we talk about life in a spiral. Life is never just a straight line. It's spiraling constantly to bring us back to things that we need to learn greater things about. And so, but knowing your addiction gets you nowhere, and that you're ready to find another way out, that is just that little beginning, that little nugget, that little beginning of recovery. I like how she says too, your body doesn't lie, the head does. What she means by that is look at what's your outward manifestations, you know, disease, obesity, all of that. Your body isn't lying. Your body's showing the effects. And it's your head that's lying. There's a lot of denial, a lot of untruth, and this is period in all obsession and addiction, because I can tell you it's true for me. I have to have help getting honest with myself. I want to share with you, everyone does. There isn't anyone, I don't believe, on the face of this planet who can get totally brutally honest with themselves, especially when they're struggling with an obsession or an addiction. It's very hard, you know, to see the picture when we're sitting inside the frame. It's very hard to get honest with ourselves when we're in a constant state of denial and lying to ourselves, and that's what we've become used to. So this is really a program and a process about rigorous honesty. You cannot do it alone. And she says that over and over again. She says, fat is the price paid for dishonest love. How true that is. You're trying to get love and fulfillment somewhere else, which is what she goes on to talk about when she's talking about the story about Karen Carpenter, about how she died of anorexia. You know, everybody was like, well, she died of a heart attack. Well, no, she died of anorexia. You know, she was in that refeed state, and her body couldn't handle it, you know. And so what happens in that kind of state is that the body can go into shock, and you can have a heart attack. You can have heart failure. And that's most likely what happened to her. But there Karen Carpenter is. She's this famous, you know, musician. And you would think, you can't look at someone's life and go, oh, well, they have enough love because they have this attention or adoration, or that's not what is missing. What is missing is where that core wound has been created. I can tell you, for me, it's my dad, right? That's that childhood wound. That's why I have to go to recovery. And it's constantly trying to feel like I'm okay, or I'm worthy, or I'm good enough, because that fracturing was created in childhood. I can't do anything about that. The fracturing is there. The effects are there. To deny them is to lie. To deny them is to completely lie to myself that I don't have work to do. And one of the things that I love about 12 steps and even learning and working that road of recovery is that one of the things I remember writing, and even my Al-Anon, my 12 steps with my Al-Anon, is that when we think of ourselves as hopeless, pitiful, and sick, we don't have to change. That's an honest statement. When we get stuck in self-pity or hopelessness, or, oh, we're just too sick to change. No, we're sick. That's true. But we're not too sick to change. We're only not going to change when we're not going to be honest with ourselves. And so she talks a lot about, you know, carrying that excess fat. It's dishonest love. It's displacing that. We're not going within and finding those core wounds and starting to heal them, turning towards self instead of self-abandoning. That's really what we do when we pick up anything that is obsessive or addictive, any type of vice that is destroying an area of our life. We're abandoning ourselves, and we're turning away from self instead of inward to self-love. We have a major self-love deficit, and that's the core of all of this. It's the premise of this whole book. And that's why fat is a family affair, because these cycles perpetuate. And she talks about the prisoners of childhood. I like this. It went really deep. And I think that depending on how ready you are to hear something like that, I think it's going to be like a shock factor. But the mother-daughter wound she talks a lot about, in that mothers transfer a lot of their displaced anger and pain onto their daughters. And I can share that from raising my girls, and still I feel like I'm way far off from ever being like recovered. But I know that I had a lot of anger issues when my girls were little, and so I would lash out frequently, even when I was married. Like I still am a highly reactive person. That's any ACA. That's any adult child of an alcoholic or a narcissistic parent or a dysfunctional family. You guys know I joke about it, but when I say ACA, I always think adult children of a-holes. And I know that that's bad to say on a video, but I'm going to keep it really real for a minute. Because when I say that, my mom's a lovely person. So I'm not talking about her. But my dad was not. He was a jerk. He was a narcissistic alcoholic. And so even if he had just been a narcissistic person and not been the alcoholic, I would have most likely ended up the same, because he was so cruel. And so, but there's also this mother-daughter wound. And I'm not even going to go into that, like my own personal stuff, because I haven't really totally examined all of that to even know what to tell you about that right now. Right now I'm still dealing with the daddy issues. But the mother-daughter wound, the mother has not really, and I do know this from raising my own daughters, so I'll say it from that perspective, is that the mother often has a lot of pain and anger that she has displaced and funneled onto those children. She has not dealt with that pain and anger. I do know that until I got into recovery, how could I have dealt with it? I wouldn't have had a clue. I had no skills. The only coping I knew was the coping that I knew, which was negative and unhealthy, because that's what I had grown up in. That's what I had learned. I did not know better. That's the case for most people. And so our children are absorbing that, whether we realize it or not. And I get so tearful when I think about this stuff, because I think if we don't take responsibility to break the cycles, they don't get broken. These things do get transferred to our kids. If we don't live in a recovered state or a recovery state, truly working on our core issues, and I don't mean you have to just swim in it nonstop, but you've got to become aware of it to change patterns that are perpetuating. And if you're noticing them in your children, you have a responsibility as a parent, because you've helped create that. And that's not to guilt trip you. And she says this over and over, and I love that about recovery, because real people in recovery, they're not going to guilt trip and shame themselves. They're going to go, I played a part. I played a part in that destruction, or I've played a part in that situation, because oftentimes, again, we're doing things and perpetuating patterns that we don't understand that we're doing, just because we're sick. We're sick people. And so she talks about how the daughter becomes, she says the daughter struggles with power and uses food as a power source and a fuel. Food is used as a power source, and it also becomes a fuel, also a vehicle for expressing her struggle. So she's expressing her pain and her anger, her mom's displaced pain and anger, through starting to binge and, eat in excess. So I thought that was really, interesting. And I believe that, because I know for my own children, there's certain characteristics there that they've had, and, with their own obsession or addictions. And I can't be blameless for that. I'm the mother that raised them. So I don't blame myself and go, well, that's all my fault. Well, I contributed to it. And so I have to accept that I contributed. And the only way that I can break those cycles again is to work my own program and to work on myself. And it's the same for them. Whether they do it or not is up to them. But I believe it's our responsibility. It's my personal responsibility as a parent to do everything I can to break that pattern and that cycle. Most eating disorders emerge in adolescence. She talks a lot about that. The mother-daughter struggle. I love how she clarifies this, and I want you to think about your own patterns and your own relationships with your mother, whether alive or deceased or whatever. She says, simply compare your obsession for excess food to your enmeshment with your mother. And that's going to clarify what your struggle with food is. Compare your obsession for excess food to your enmeshment with your mother. And that's going to clarify a lot of what your relationship with food is. But she talks about how it's an emotional struggle to separate from previous programming. We are all pre-wired. We're all pre-programmed because we've grown up with our parents' habits and behaviors and all of that. And so we are perpetuating the same. And if you grew up in a dysfunctional family or a family where there wasn't safety, security, and intimacy and real love, then you are pre-programmed for, unfortunately, a lot of failure. And so we have to be able to separate from that programming and to develop new programming and new coping skills. And it takes time, it takes work, because you have to become aware of what is unhealthy before you can form what's healthy. She also talks about how you may marry your mother, meaning that however your mother treats you or whatever she kind of did, if she was even like more overprotective or controlling or fearful, a lot of times you're going to end up marrying the type of person that's going to treat you very similar to your mother, at least with mother-daughters. And so not that you're going to marry a woman, but you're going to marry a man that is going to perpetuate or have a lot of the same characteristics or ways of treating you as your mother did. And so she says also, most people can function well without examining their relationships, right? Not everybody has to sit there in a constant state of examining their relationship. They just function fairly well. However, anyone who's food obsessed or any type of codependent, that relationship, I say any addict, any issue of addiction and obsession, that relationship has to be examined because it's dysfunctional and it's perpetuating destructive patterns and habits. I like how she also talks about how what we really don't want to do is we really don't want to give up learned behaviors, if we're honest with ourselves. We, again, perpetuate cycles of fear, excitement, pain, powerlessness, hopelessness. We live and perpetuate a lot of the same cycles. And we also can become addicted to disappointment and pain. And I have to continually remind myself of that as an ACA, because that's one of the main things that we become addicted to is our own pain. And that's a little bit tough too, because if you've genuinely gone through a legitimately traumatic situation or separation from someone, you know, whether it's an estranged parent, child, ex-spouse, whatever it is, you have legitimate pain. And so it's a little bit more of a struggle, I think, for an ACA to try to process that pain or trauma versus indulging in it. And, you know, over here there's the healing side and over here there's the indulging side. And so it's something that I think is a little bit of a delicate balance when you've gone through some type of loss or big shift in life. She also talks about how food obsessed or food addicts are also thrown off more by distractions and external stimuli. I thought that was interesting because I've noticed, even being around other addicts, true addicts like gamblers, alcoholics, porn addicts, whatever. I've been, I think, around them all because I'm the codependent, you know, funneling all of my energy into them and trying to fix them because I'm a fixer. Of course, I'm an ACA, so that's a fixer. But and she talks about that because codependents are constantly reacting to the needs of others. We immerse ourselves in the needs of others, and a big part of that is so that we don't have to pay attention to our own wounds, our own issues. And so that's good in a caregiving setting, like nursing or healthcare or whatever, but it's terrible in a relationship because you just become completely immersed and obsessed with that other person, and you lose focus of yourself completely. That's what the codependent and any type of, in this situation, is talking about the food obsessed, but that's the relationship that they develop. She goes on to say that codependents usually come from families with addictive parents. I'm going to go on to add that not only addictive parents, but also narcissistic parents and dysfunctional families, meaning controlling parents. Super controlling parents, and they'll talk about this in ACA. They don't say it's just adult children of alcoholics anymore. It's adult children of dysfunctional families. There's such a huge part of me that I wish that they could change that name, because so many people belong. I believe everybody belongs in that program, but so many people belong in that program that aren't getting the help that they truly need because they don't think they qualify because they didn't grow up with an alcoholic. It's the same. Anytime you've got a family member where there's lack of love, intimacy, there's fear-created pain, all of that, you have a lot of those same characteristics in adult children. And what is even an adult child? It's an adult that has carried a lot of their childhood isms into adulthood, just because they developed them when they were younger as survival and coping mechanisms, but now they're destructive. As they're carrying them through adulthood, they're destructive. So there's a whole pre-programming that has to be relearned. And you don't relearn anything until you learn about who you even are and why you do what you do. So she talks about how codependents develop this, and this goes back to an ACA too. Anybody who grew up in alcoholism, narcissistic parent, controlling parent. I say the same things over and over because I want them to sink in. I want them to anchor in your brain, because if you really want help, these are the things that are going to help you. And I'm a big clarifier of emotions and things that happen. Sometimes that can be annoying to people, but it's the only way that I can process it in order to get healthier, so that I can understand what to do with that emotion. Because I'm a super sensitive person with highly developed emotions, right? Like high sensitivity, and I'm continuing to develop emotionally, even myself. But I'm very sensitive to other people and things, and so that would go right along with this developing a hypervigilance. Because you grew up with a controlling parent or an addict parent, you're used to having to monitor behavior, because that's what we're used to. So that's a form of also PTSD, hypervigilance. It's because you've been traumatized, you develop that hypervigilance. That doesn't go away. If you've been raised in a very dysfunctional family, or a family where you're walking on eggshells, or you've had a lot of berating or abuse, mental or emotional abuse, that carries into adulthood. And you become hypervigilant and just obsessed with what other people are doing instead of living your own life. So she talks about both food obsessed and CPs are highly responsive to each other, and way too little in touch with themselves. So she goes on to talk about the different types of struggles that, and I would put it in any category, any addict, but she talks about in particular the food obsessed and the CP, which is the confluent personality / codependent personality has. And so the different struggles. Number one is ego struggles. Number one is passive aggressive struggles. I love how she clarified this, because I underlined it and I said, oh my, that's me. She talks about the passive aggressive struggles, and I've been told when I was doing some coaching, I wasn't told I was passive aggressive, but I was told that adult children can be. And so I have to monitor for that behavior of being passive aggressive, and I can. I'm finding now when I outwardly write things, even on social media. If I'm angry, that's more of really a passive aggressive thing, and that's something where I'm going, okay, that's an area where I need to control that better. So can I blog it? Is that safer? Is that still passive aggressive? I'm not sure. I'll clarify that in ACA. But again, probably a more therapeutic way to do it would just be to journal it, right? Because I'm not harming anyone by journaling it. So I have to ask myself those honest questions because I'm not perfect. I do imperfect things every day. And again, I try to have some compassion on myself because it's what I was raised in also. I've developed a lot of unhealthy habits myself, but also I'm a good person, so I'm not going to overly beat myself up about it either. That's recovery. That's where you really start to get into that recovery. I'm getting recovered. So she talks about aggressive people usually attach themselves to people who are needy. I find that to be true. I've had that happen in my life. And she talks, when I was talking about how the food obsessed, they're more, or any type of addict, they're more responsive to their external stimuli, their environment, they're reactors. And that, again, that would go back to classifying an ACA too, is they're high reactors. Extremism, she talks about everything in this chapter is just really powerful, deep stuff. And so she's talking about how they're reactors, passive-aggressive struggles. One of the things that she says in here is she's talking about aggressive people, and she says that highly aggressive people are highly critical and judgmental of everybody around them. And she also says, as much as she longs to be cared for, she's talking about, she calls her aggressive Angela. She says, as much as she longs to be cared for, it is safer to be giving. So listen to this next line. Often such patients are nurses. They have found a profession that helps them maintain their giver role but keeps them fat. So they're safer in a giving role. That's their form of control. And also their form of control is overeating and indulging and staying heavy. It was really interesting. So she talks about ego struggles, recovery. She says recovery involves assuming an image of yourself that has nothing to do with someone else's success or failures. So it's really about clarifying getting a real perception of you. Not a downing one, not a degrading one, or where you're shaming yourself, but a real, true assessment of your good and bad. And that's the beauty of working, again, a recovery program, where even when you get to step 4, you list that positive, negative kind of cycle, so you can really start to clarify and see yourself the right way. Anger blockers. I love when she talks about this. She says, I've not yet met a food-obsessed person who was not raging within. They all are. Any addict, I would say this is true for a lot of codependents too, the majority, they're full of rage. And that rage is being shoved and stuffed with food. There are ways to get out rage, and you actually have to get some of it out. I've screamed into pillows. I've broken dishes. When I was married to an addict, I won't tell you, I won't go there, which one. I would go out in the garage. I remember, and I was told to do this as an exercise to get rid of some of my rage because I was so frustrated inside. And I would take dishes and I would break them. I'd break them on the cement floor. It helped. It actually did help. Screaming into a pillow, crying, getting out that rage, getting out that angst. She also says recovery with anger, it involves acknowledging that you're angry and also telling someone else your feelings. I think too that there are ways, like I just explained, to get anger out. And I was actually coached to do that, to get that anger out. So she goes on to talk about hopelessness cycles, perfectionism. And what I like that she says about the hopelessness cycle is that food obsessed and codependents, both, or CPs, confluent personalities, have years of failed attempts at controlling, because they've had years of attempts failed attempts at controlling. They've lowered their expectations and they've lost motivation to try anything new. She says this hopelessness must be expressed. Again, this is self-honesty. This is getting real and raw with yourself. The hopelessness must be expressed before recovery can begin. You've got to do that purge of just expressing how you really are feeling inside. And she also says that people don't want to hope often because they don't want to change. Now that's getting real. That's getting honest. Do you want to be hopeful? Maybe you don't because you don't really want to change. And that's honesty. She talks about magical thinking. I would refer you back to program 2, the video about diet fads, the myths, the fad dieting. It's all true, right? That's magical thinking. Thinking that keto and Atkins and, I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on, right? It gives me a headache. You know how I get. That's magical thinking. It's constantly thinking that something extreme, being an extremist, and she talks about extremists. That's all the keto people, all right? They're extremists right now because they're not dealing with the real core issue. The core issue is learning about food, learning what's in it, learning how to eat, learning how to portion, learning how to keep it simplified. And the bigger issue we all know is where we are right now. Fat is a family affair. It's emotional. So she talks about perfectionism. You either play I love this, you either play perfect success or perfect failure. And she goes on to talk about, too, the low frustration tolerance. She says, low frustration, inside you're saying, do it my way faster. When others don't perform to your expectations, you get extremely irritated. You use food to maintain your serenity instead of dealing with your emotions. That was very powerful because it's giving you that immediate gratification, that immediate soothing. It's negative coping, but it's giving you that immediate gratification until it doesn't work anymore, right? Until it's destroying us and it doesn't work anymore. And she talks about moralistic attitudes. I like that because she kind of really talks about how any type of addict or obsessed person kind of sits in judgment of not only themselves but others with morals. And a lot of times it's very skewed, so that was interesting. All or nothing mentality, big. That's every extremist or obsessive or addict type person. They also complain that recovery is boring. Yeah, that's some humble pie right there. They're used to living in chaos. They're used to creating their own chaos because they're addicted to their own chaos and pain and excitement and fear and perpetuating cycles of crap. So she says either you're stuck on a rigidly abusive eating plan or you eat the refrigerator bare. That's often a food obsessed. She also talks about workaholics. I think this is really interesting because oftentimes you'll even see someone that's had gastric bypass or even an alcoholic who stopped alcohol go to default to food and cigarettes. Or you'll see someone who's had gastric bypass default to alcohol. And they can't drink very much, but they'll try to push it. So there's always like something. So if you're not dealing with the ism, what's getting you there, the core wound again, you're going to just develop another outlet of obsession or addiction. And the key is you may never, ever be able to completely 100% heal that area of life where you're just not obsessive anymore. But you've got to be able to take whatever's unhealthy and funnel it into something that's healthy, that's not self-destructive. Learning how to do more emotional self-soothing. And we're going to be talking about that. I have a video coming up about that. But learning how to emotionally self-soothe. These are important things to learn. And again, funneling that negative coping into something that's positive. That can also be obsessive, but it's at least positive. But a lot of anyone who's recovering from a food obsession, they're also often workaholics, or even if they start recovering from a food obsession, they become more of a workaholic because, again, they're trying to funnel their obsession into just something else. She talks about people pleasers and fear of success and fear of intimacy. People pleasers, they're going to constantly be resentful, right? And resentment, if you study addiction at all or obsessions, the root of most of it is resentments. And so that's like number one is resentments, holding core anger and resentments in. And you're going to be that if you're a people pleaser, if you're constantly trying to make everybody happy, which you can't. And we all have fractured relationships in our lives. People are not perfect. We don't all have these stellar relationships all over the place. Sometimes there's falling out and all of that kind of stuff, and we have to deal with that. We can't please everyone. And especially when we're living in recovery, in a recovery state, we're actually going to piss a lot of people off because they're not ready for you to change. They don't want to see that change because it upsets the whole cycle. Whether it's a healthy change or not, and it creates healthy changes or not, you're upsetting the apple cart, and you're creating that change, and it's going to upset everyone. They're used to how things are. So you have to prepare for that. It gets worse before it gets better. I can promise you that. And I like people that are going into trying to make changes, or committing, I should say. Trying doesn't work. Committing to make changes. They have to understand, you have to understand that it's going to get worse before it gets better. You're going to piss a lot of people off, friends, family members, relationships are going to change. As you go through recovery, you're going to lose friendships. You're going to lose relationships, maybe even with some family members, depending on how they react, because they're reactive too to your recovery. And I have had that. I can't tell you how much I've had of that cycling in and out of, and it's not all controllable. You have to let people go that aren't on board with your recovery. And it doesn't mean that those relationships won't come back, but they may or may not. You have to be able to accept that if you really want recovery. For me, I'm willing to do whatever it takes at this point. So I don't want to live in perpetuating cycles of just self-destructive behaviors and patterns, or have other people that are around me that have that also. I want a healthier life. So one of the things I love that she talked about is that fear of success and fear of intimacy. The primary fear for that is because once you have achieved it, you're afraid you'll have to maintain it. It's that fear of maintaining it. So it's not just that you fear achieving it. It's really that you fear, the primary fear is that you fear you'll have to maintain it. I thought that was really interesting. She talks about isolationists. Of course, every obsessed and addict goes into isolation. Codependents do as well. Any addiction or obsession progresses, which again, they always do. They always get worse. They don't get better unless they are interrupted. You've got to be working a recovery program or they will get worse. It's the cycle of addiction. It doesn't change for anybody. So as it gets worse, you become less and less tolerable of being alone. Why? Because you go into guilt, self-loathing, and worry. That is an addict or an obsessed person when they're by themselves. And so then they go eat. And it's perpetuating cycles, shame, binging, going into shame, isolation. It's constant. And so the way out, she says, is through people. And this is why group sessions and 12 steps and coming to group, showing up for group and coaching, doing even one-on-one. That's why one-on-one coaching is so important. It's developing a safe relationship with someone who's also, and I love how she talks about this. Loneliness isn't longing for company. It's longing for kind. I can't just go hire anybody or talk to anybody about my special needs in recovery unless they're in recovery themselves, unless they've walked that road. It's not going to help me the same way that it is going to with someone who's actually working recovery. So the way out is through people, but it's not through just anybody. It's through people that are of your kind, meaning they're also sufferers and strugglers too, but they're working a program. They're working on changing. They're working on making those changes. So loneliness isn't longing for company, it's longing for kind. Kind, meaning that we need people around us that are like us, that are sharing the same struggles. OA, that's why Overeaters Anonymous is so phenomenal for that, because it gives us that, it removes a lot of that isolation, which is where we find ourselves stuck. So she goes on to talk about a lot about the victim and the enabler, and I'm not going to go too into that because the victim, the enabler, the persecutor, this is a really heavy chapter. It's very heavy. And I just absolutely loved it. I loved reading about Vanessa and Elvira when Elvira goes away to college. But she talks a lot about that because, you know, it kind of goes into the whole victim, enabler, persecutor, the clown. Like that particular story doesn't go into all of that. She talks about the hero, the recluse, the survivors. She talks about the family system, the dysfunctionality of the family system. And what's interesting about it is that, again, if you're going to study like any family, any dysfunctional family, everyone in that family plays a role. And when you start to learn, like, even what your role was, you start to understand why your family dynamics are the way they are, why your relationships with your family have formed the way that they have, why they've continued the way that they have. And I like when she says right here with serenity, we don't even know how to live calmly. Like, we don't even know how to live healthy. But so she goes on to talk about also Vanessa and Elvira. I thought that was really good. How Elvira, you see where she develops clear boundaries with her mom, saying, you know, these are your issues. This is what you want for my life, but I'm telling you that this is what's healthy and this is what I want for my life. Again, that's where we start to piss people off. And you can see that from that story, because her mom is like, I want you to do what I want you to do. And Elvira is going, no, I'm going to live my own life. I don't want to live the life that you have preconceived for me. And so she had to make boundaries, and it made her mom upset, right? Because her mom wasn't in control. That's life. That's life getting healthy, is that you're going to upset the apple cart and a lot of people. And then lastly, now one of the things that she wrote about, and I do want to just finish with this, is that I literally just wanted to cry when I read about, I won't go into it because I'll start crying. I don't want to cry in this video. But when she talks about the little girl that finds her mom going on yet another diet, and she comes home and she finds her, crumpled over with alcohol and food, and, can't wake her up, and she starts beating her with a shoe. It's so sad, because here's this poor little child that she's a victim. She's a victim of her mother's insanity. And yet there she is, loving and hating her mother. That's the perfect explanation of an addict, any type of obsessed/codependent relationship. There's such a love-hate there. And this is just a really tragic story of all of that. But this is where a lot of these things go. And then she talks about the Karen Carpenter story. And she says, the very last line in this, and I'll close with this, is, we die of the inability to find a way to get our hearts filled. That's really the bottom line. So I can just share with you my own testimony of living in recovery, and it's an imperfect recovery, okay? It's not perfect. Is there such thing? I don't think so. However, showing up to meetings, having sponsorship, working with sponsorship, getting more honest with yourself, getting deeper in your sponsorship, coaching, mentoring, showing up. That is where we continue to get more honest, and it's a journey. So, but it's worth it. I would never want to live without it at this point. Can't even imagine it. Wouldn't want to go back to that horrible insanity. And I'm still working my way out, right? Because I was in this, this relationship that was not healthy. But working your way out of it and working your way into recovery, it's worth it. It makes life so much sweeter. And I really have a testimony of that programs work and people can change. So I love chapter 4. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, the little recap, and I encourage you to just go back through and highlight and reread some of these chapters and digest it as you can. All right, I'll see you guys soon.